Morning, and on behalf of Mobilityways, it's my pleasure to welcome you to this latest Thought Leadership webinar. Thanks for participating. For those new to Mobilityways, we are a leader in transport decarbonisation and the leader in tackling commuting emissions. The aim of these regular sessions is to support learning and invite collaboration on transport and sustainable travel topics, and today we are considering how to prepare for a fleet transition to zero-emission vehicles. For today's session, I'm delighted to be joined by Chris Hillcoat and Michael Bunker from KPMG. Chris, Michael, welcome. Given the fast pace of change in the systems delivering the movement of people and goods, so Chris and Michael will provide latest context, highlight challenges, and outline elements to consider when preparing and implementing a fleet transition. Behaviour change is key to delivering fleet change and is equally important when tackling other travel emissions generated by an organisation, namely business travel and employee commuting, both Scope 3 carbon categories. Following KPMG, I will provide a little more information on the latter and the work Mobilityways undertakes to advance sustainable travel within workplaces. We have an hour for this webinar and are aiming for at least 20 minutes for questions, so please add and upvote these along with general comments via the Q&A function. Given the depth and breadth of the subject being covered, it is likely some questions will go unanswered, and so those we don't get to in the hour will be followed up over email. This session is also being recorded and a link will be circulated afterwards, so you will be able to watch back and share with colleagues. Okay, so for now, from me, Chris, Michael, over to you.
Great, thank you very much, Graeme. Thanks everyone for joining and very good morning. My name is Chris Hillcoat. I'm an Associate Director at KPMG in the UK. I work in our future mobility team. And in our team, we look at some of the most pressing issues facing transport and mobility for the public sector, for employers, for private sector, for everyone, really. And fleet transition is one of those topics which is becoming more and more important. And even in the news in the last few weeks, we've seen several really significant changes around energy, fuel, pricing, taxation. And if you're running a business or you're responsible for the fleet in your organization, you may be thinking, what do I need to do? When do I need to make a change? How do I change? How do I plan and execute and evaluate a transition of the vehicles that I own or I control or that my employees are using? And so this morning we want to give you a little bit of a summary of our thinking in this space, which is something that our team has got quite a lot of experience in. So if we flick on to the content slide next, what we'll be doing is looking at, perhaps we can go back a second, the previous slide. What we'll be doing is looking at, firstly, some questions about context. So why now? Why is this important? We'll look at some of the most common challenges that people have when they're considering and executing a fleet transition. Then I'll run us through the framework that we've developed here in KPMG for looking at fleet transition and some of the topics that we need to consider. And we break that down into two main sections. The first is how to plan for a pilot of a fleet transition, and the second is how to move that into a full-scale execution. And then, as well as the technical and commercial elements of that, we'll also highlight some of the behavioural change elements and the thinking that we've done in relation to that. And then after we've finished, I'll hand back over to Graeme, and Graeme will give us a bit of a content on Mobilityways. So first of all, I'm going to hand over to Michael, and Michael's going to help us with some of the context and the background to why now is an important time to consider fleet transition. So Michael, over to you.
Thanks, Chris. Hi, everybody. I'm Mike Bunker. I'm part of the Future Mobility team with Chris at KPMG. And just to give you a bit of context and overview as to why people are actually looking to transition their fleets now and why could it also be the time to transition fleets. I mean, a lot of this is quite dependent on the types of vehicles and the makeup of your fleet, and also the use cases for these vehicles. But we are starting to see that for quite a large number of vehicle types, especially in the sort of lower weight segments, and also within the higher weight segments that are doing smaller duty cycles, potentially within kind of hub and spoke models where you're operating from depot to depot. You are starting to see that electric vehicles actually have the functionality and capability to meet a lot of the requirements for fleets. And this has actually been kind of prevalent for us in recent times as we have more and more organizations, local authorities, and also operators of heavy duty vehicles coming to us to ask if they can help us, if we can help them set up new trials or help set up the structure to start transitioning these fleets going forward. But a bit of the kind of context of why now and why in the past 2 to 3 years this is starting to become more palatable for organizations. Well, as you can see here on the screen, we have sort of a number of the different benefits that are really getting driven by this. So you can see that there's the vehicle choice and the actual kind of capability of these vehicles across multiple sectors started to improve greatly. There's been a lot of new entrants of models into the market, and as of today, there's 160 battery electric car and van models within the UK. This is a 25% increase over the past year. And there's expected to be a further 60 in 2026 coming to market. So you can really see that the options for fleet transition are really starting to grow. And that's also been seen within the sort of heavier duty vehicles as well, with 30 zero-emission HGVs currently available on the market today in various body types and weight categories. And this is expected to increase quite largely over the next couple of years as well, as you see more Chinese models coming into the market. You'll also see that OEMs aren't actually reaching the kind of sale targets that they're looking to achieve. So the ZEV mandate has basically mandated that there's certain targets for new vehicles to be battery electric or just zero emission. So in 2025, the target for that was 28% share of all new cars registered to be zero emission. But within the sort of actual BEV market share, there was only 23% of these vehicles that were actually reaching these standards. This was then causing some of the manufacturers to actually provide discount on the label price of these vehicles to ensure that the demand can actually be met, which is then actually starting to drive further transition going forward. You'll also see as well that there's been a large increase in number of public charge points, with a 60% increase over the last 2 years, which is then actually reducing the range anxiety, as there's now about 86,000 public charge points available across the markets. So the actual kind of capability and choice of these vehicles is really starting to drive that transition. You'll also see as well that there's benefits being driven through different grant funding, so the kind of policy and regulation, but also the staff and customer benefits that are being driven through that as well. So within the sort of salary sacrifice schemes that are being provided by organisations, about 80,000 employees are now actually gaining access and using these salary sacrifice schemes, which is then driving the increase in electric vehicles within grey fleets. And also the use of the kind of government grant funding, where you'll see that there's the plug-in grant from the government, which is providing up to 3,750 of grant funding towards an electric car. And you'll also have seen that the plug-in truck grant, which was actually announced in the past week, is providing up to 120,000 worth of grant funding towards HGVs. So you can see that the government is really starting to push this with the policy and the grant funding that is being deployed across the market, and also the future kind of policy measures and benefits that are going to be provided, i.e. through future road user charging, and also the fleet transition targets that the government is targeting, is really starting to actually push organisations, especially within local authorities, to start their drive towards electric vehicles, with the government grant, with the government local authorities looking to achieve all electric vehicles for the majority of use case vehicles by 2027, 2028. So you can see that really there is that sort of onus and push to try and firstly create cost parity in vehicle types and duty cycle types that may not currently be achievable with the current technology and the current vehicle prices. But policy is really starting to shift towards that to try and drive that over the next 3 to 5 years to ensure that the government can meet the net zero targets that they're targeting up until 2050. So that's just an overview as to sort of the why now. If we could go to the next slide. Just why has there been that sort of slowdown, and why are the targets not actually being able to be met to the current standards to date? I sort of mentioned that we have the ZEV mandate targets of 80% of new cars to be zero emission by 2030 and 100% of new cars and vans to be zero emission by 2035, and there's sort of stage gates to achieve that. Now, organizations haven't actually been managing to hit these targets, or the manufacturers and the organizations looking to purchase the vehicles. And this is often because of a lot of the vehicles aren't actually able to meet the duty cycles and capabilities that are being required by organizations, but also by individuals that are maybe operating these grey fleets. And people are saying that they need to have more tailored solutions, or the charging infrastructure isn't there in place. As I mentioned in the slide before, this is starting to turn, but in a lot of areas, that sort of initial upfront capital to undertake that transition, albeit through either purchasing a vehicle or installing the charging infrastructure at your depot, at the offices, or at employees' households, is quite a large overarching expenditure. And this is something that has been creating challenges throughout the process of the transition, but has also been seen to cause further delays. If you actually look at maybe upgrading your grid connection, albeit it might be quite expensive, it also has large delays through the grid connection providers. So these two sort of challenges of the cost and the actual delay in getting the grid infrastructure in place has created a fair amount of challenge for organizations and individuals looking to transition. This has also been emphasized by some government flip-flopping in regulation and policy. You'll have seen in the most recent budget that there's been an introduction of a pay per mile on EVs, and the Office for Budget Responsibility has estimated that this is going to create a reduction of EV sales by some 440,000 between November 2025 and March 2031. These reported measures are being looking to be counteracted by reducing the VAT rate that is being applied on charging, on public charging. So public charging currently has a 20% VAT rate, whereas home charging has a 5% VAT rate. This is looking to be switched down to that 5% for public charging. However, these elements haven't actually been put into place yet, and a lot of this is still speculation. So the government has been providing government grant funding, and they have been providing measures which are going to try and increase the uptake of EVs, but there are certain policy indicators which are also counteracting those points of view and creating uncertainty within the market. So it is making it quite difficult for people to plan ahead, as when you are looking to undertake your kind of total cost of ownership calculations across different vehicle types, you need to have a sort of clear and overarching view as to what those costs are going to be in the future, as a lot of the time, you know, these life cycle decisions are 3 to 5 to 7 years. So all of these need to be kind of baked into the decisions that are getting made. So we would prefer if obviously the government were providing us a clear indication of what this is going to be going forward, but this is just some of the conversations that we've been having with organisations and why they haven't actually been transitioning at the pace they were hoping for. So if we could go to the next slide, and I can pass you over to Chris to give a bit of an overview as to how KPMG can help in this.
Brilliant. Thank you, Michael, for setting the scene for us there. So lots going on, a really changing and complex environment. And for every organisation and every individual, these changes will affect you differently. And so there is clearly no one-size-fits-all approach to a fleet transition. It's not something that we can write on a piece of paper and issue to everyone. It has to be done bespoke for every organisation, because you as an organisation have your own operational needs, your own employees, your duty cycles, your own financial pressures. And so what we've put together here is our thinking on the kind of topics that you probably want to consider. And you can see that we've broken them into two groups. So the blue ones on the left, we think are more suited for the early stage, which is asking those questions of why do you want to do this? And what is it that you want to do? And how would you get it set up in the first instance? And then in the second stage on the right, if you were to roll this out across your fleet, then there are some more detailed questions to look at. But those are a little bit further down the track. So on this left-hand side, we look at these early stage questions of how does this align with your strategy as an organization? How does it align with what you want to do for your customers? How you want to look at financial and environmental impact? And then once you decide to go ahead, at least with a pilot, you'll be thinking about, you don't want to do everything all at once. It's sensible to look at the vehicles that you use, and actually for many organizations, understanding the vehicles that you own and control is a useful first step, and is not always as obvious as it might seem. And of those vehicles, what types do you have? What kind of segments are they in? What kind of markets and routes and sites are they serving? And allied to that, then you'd think about the operations of those vehicles. What is the kind of duty cycle that they're doing? How long are they driving? How far? What is the geography that they're going through? And as well as electric vehicles, we need electric charging infrastructure. And for many organizations, there are some big questions to ask about. Do I want to own my own charging infrastructure? Do I want to be installing it on my own site? Do I want to rely on public charge points, especially for cars and light vans? And of course, for many people, there may be an option for them to charge their own vehicles at home. And as Michael was saying, that has until now been more attractive in terms of cost. So those are some of the issues to look at in the first instance. And then in the second half, we would then suggest looking at some of the more detailed questions of how do you do this? So how do you get an energy supply that is allied and tied to your requirements, which of course are expected to grow over time? Some organizations look at signing a power purchase agreement or a PPA, which gives them a degree of certainty over the medium term in the energy that they need and at the cost that is attractive. You might even look at generating the energy on your own premises as well, rather than or as well as relying on the grid connections. And then there are some issues around technology and data. And in many regards, this is an opportunity more than a challenge. So newer vehicles with telematics and charging infrastructure generates a lot of information. And for many organizations, that information could be of great value for improving efficiency, operations, and identifying areas to grow. Financing of EVs and fleet transition is a really key question. And as we mentioned earlier, there's a shifting sands of government grants, of reducing total cost of ownership, OEMs to some extent reducing prices, and looking at the second-hand market, which is also growing in value and attractiveness. And then finally, there's a question around the organization itself. So how do you set up the governance to do this? Do you need to change the way that you run your business, or do you need to set up any new elements? How do you look at the measures and incentives to help your people with the transition? And we'll look at that a little bit later on. So let's go to the next slide, please. And we'll just look then briefly at this early stage pilot. Our experience is that at the moment, most organizations looking to pilot will be towards the heavy goods end of the spectrum, rather than the lighter goods or car usage, which have been a bit more mature for a bit longer. Really, the key to pilot is the evaluation. So understanding what are the objectives of your pilot, how will you know when you've met them, and how will you check that you have actually achieved what you wanted to do? Those are the key questions. And you can see on the diagram here, I've just put down a few areas to look at of sort of headlines of thinking about, for example, what are the strategies in place in your organization? Do they need to be changed or amended or updated? Looking at the operational planning of the duty cycles, the trip types, the scheduling and rostering of people. Looking at the kind of routes that you take. So, for example, one of the organisations we've been working with it has a logistics provider, and they're delivering heavy goods all around the country. And their model is that the vehicle sets off in the morning or at the start of the cycle with 40 tons or worth of goods in the back. And as they go, they're dropping off, and the vehicle becomes lighter, and of course that affects the battery performance and the engine performance of the vehicle. And so actually the modeling of the duty cycles and the number of drops is a really important part of understanding how viable it will be to shift to electric for particular kinds of trips. And we've got things like cost analysis. We've got the trends for what other benchmark organizations are doing. And key to the pilot is both the evaluation strategy, but also the scaling into the future. So if it were that you carry out a pilot and you decide it's been successful, you don't want to have to then reinvent everything in order to grow the pilot out to a full deployment. Really, you'd want to put the building blocks in place first to then grow it out and scale it to a larger fleet transition. So that's around the pilots. Let's move on to the next slide then. Thank you. To look at if you were to go further, what we're calling an enterprise level transition. So this is thinking about if you wanted to reach the target, which most organizations have either set themselves or been set by government, of reaching net zero in their emissions. Of course, we've got overarching government targets of net zero, which many organizations have adopted. Also in the public sector, these things are coming down the track much sooner, and regulations around purchasing and leasing vehicles will come into place as soon as next year, which will almost force your hand in terms of the kind of vehicles that you're looking at. These are some of the topics that we'd like to suggest are important. So around energy, how do you procure and supply the energy that you need? Do you want to source and install it yourself or use public facilities? And is there a case for signing a power purchase agreement to give security over the longer time? On tech and data, taking this digital first approach means that the data that's generated is viewed as a valuable asset for the organization, and that as well as the information that's generated, the way that the fleet is managed and the service management provider that you have for your technology, those should all be integrated together really to look at both the data sets that are being generated and the analytics that can be done by comparing it with other information that you have. Thirdly, on financing, we're seeing that the total cost of ownership for different types of vehicles is changing, and it can be difficult for organizations to pin down a point at which that becomes either an attractive proposition or a kind of must-have for changing, and that's different across different segments and sectors. But it may well be that you need to look at different funding models around that financing, because the traditional routes of purchase and lease are available, but then there are other sort of blended options which might, for example, lease elements of the vehicle, even the battery itself, or it might look at the charging and the infrastructure as part of that financing package. It's important to consider all of these things and look at how they might change into the future. Fourthly, an organization then, the people and the skills. So it's critical to think about this, isn't it? We can't plan a technology transition and not bring our people into it. We want to make sure that the governance model is fit for purpose, and that the people in your organization have got the right training and the right skills to make that transition a success. And critically, it's not really a question of just replacing one type of vehicle with another. We want to go beyond that. We want to look at those broader and deeper questions, which includes then at the end preparing for launch with the internal marketing, communications, and information that's available to people, so that people are brought along with you and that they really understand what's going on. And a bit later on, Graeme will talk a bit more about how employees are a really critical part of this. But let's go on to the next slide, please, where I just want to highlight for a few minutes this behavioural change approach that I think is really important. As we mentioned, the technology around shifting vehicles is complex on its own, but actually there are these broader questions of people and culture and behaviour that could make a really important difference. So as well as shifting vehicles, these are some of the things that we might want to consider to reach some of the benefits that Michael outlined earlier, the financial benefits and the benefits of people's well-being, the benefits of recruitment and retention, and the sustainability benefits of reaching net zero targets. And you could think of these 5 things as being done sequentially, perhaps in parallel, but if you start on the left and work your way through, you're likely to achieve benefits sooner. So the first thing you might want to think about is, are there ways to reduce the need to travel altogether? A lot of organizations have been doing this, and clearly in the last 5 years the world of business travel has changed enormously, but there is still potentially an opportunity to look at measures to reduce the actual overall number of trips, which could of course have an effect on the number of vehicles that are being used in an organization. Secondly, then, looking at replacing. So instead of people driving a vehicle on their own, and this is perhaps thinking more about travel by car, there could well be an option in some places and at some times for some people to look at car sharing, or breaking down the silos in your organization and working with other teams, or the use of public transport and active travel in areas where it's available. The third point is around relocating. So it may be that as part of an estate's strategy or a longer term planning exercise, you may think about consolidating where people are working, so that again the need to travel is considered as part of that planning exercise. Fourthly, we've got the refueling, and that's sort of what we're here to talk about, of the shift from internal combustion to zero emission. And finally, the rethinking question is, what other technologies are out there that might reduce the need to make certain trips? And if we hop on to the next slide, please, I'll just illustrate this briefly with a case study before I hand back over to Graeme. This is a case study of a fleet strategy that we carried out last year for a large public sector organisation. This organisation has lots of different teams covering a large part of the country, doing lots of different operational and technical tasks. And the fleet strategy is part of a wider decarbonisation and net zero strategy that this organisation has. And so they brought us in to help them with it. And what we found actually is that within the organisation, the different teams were operating pretty independently of each other, and each had, in many cases, their own vehicles and their own ways of working and their own requirements for travel, many of which duplicated others. And there were examples where 2 or 3 people might be making a very similar trip for a quite similar purpose that could have been combined or shared together had the planning been in place. And so we found that by looking at the data from their grey fleet, which is where employees are driving their own vehicles, as well as the employer's own fleet, we could build a picture of what are the travel patterns that are going on, and what kind of journey purposes are there out there. And we used the 5 R's approach that I just explained on the previous slide, and we looked team by team at how each of those 5 R's could be applied to each of the kind of different journey purposes that they had. So site visits, or attending meetings, or technical visits, or whatever it might be. And we were able to work with the teams to suggest reductions and changes in their travel, which all added up to a really significant change, even before you get to the refueling and the shifting from internal combustion to electric. So that was a really interesting exercise, and you can see the numbers there on the screen, that 1.5 million miles a year being driven, split equally between employees' own vehicles, which often these grey fleet vehicles tend to be older, tend to be less well maintained, they tend to have higher emissions, and actually there are also potentially issues around insurance and capability of these vehicles. So there's a really big scope for making changes as part of a wider strategy, where the fleet transition is considered holistically as part of the sort of changes that they want to make. So that's it from me. I'll hand back to Graeme, who's going to think about the employees and the smarter commuting elements. My email address is on the slide here, but please do reach out by email or on LinkedIn if you want to get in touch.
Amazing. Thanks, Chris. Thanks, Michael. Yeah, I'm just going to cover off a few bits, but a few questions coming through. But please, whilst I'm chatting as well, think about the topics that have just been covered by Chris and Michael, and do add some further questions. We'll come back to those shortly. So yes, absolutely. And it's important what we're talking about here, because we're developing an association with KPMG, because both of our organisations recognise that we're like-minded, if you like, when it comes to deploying frameworks and affecting behaviour change. And so with that in mind, as you can see on the slide, let's dip into employee commuting, which is a Scope 3 emission category. I think the first thing to highlight, Scope 3 emissions generally are a challenge. They're typically harder to measure, they're harder to reduce, and typically more dependent on behaviour change, which takes time and requires consistent commitment. Where commuting is concerned, it is true that COVID has permanently altered the way of working, but it's important too to recognise that hybrid working is not an option for every organisation. And within that, there's going to be component parts where it's an opportunity, and other functions it's not. An Ipsos survey published in September 2023 highlighted that 2/3 of workers are in the office for 3 days or more each week. Our own survey suggests similar, with an increasing emphasis from many of our clients on a return to the office. Perhaps the biggest challenge is budget. A case for investment made solely on cutting carbon is unlikely to get approval, so linking to operations is key. And I think Chris mentioned operations, employees, etc. earlier too. So again, we're seeing great commonality between these strategies. Supporting colleagues with cost of living, advancing physical and mental well-being, and future-proofing resourcing strategy are all important levers. If struggling to make the business case stack up in your own organisation, do get in touch after this webinar. Next slide. So focusing in on behaviour change, which is obviously a theme running through both the presentations. So we see in this slide how we link this element to our overall framework of measurement, reduction and reporting. Our approach to advancing sustainable travel centres on tech-enabled tools for both employers and employees, plus a service layer comprising delivery and account management. To briefly summarise our services, 2 final slides. Next slide. The first, tools for employers. This is centred around measurement. We can support with baselining commuting habits through surveys and calculating a carbon footprint. But beyond that, we can go further in terms of surfacing sustainable commuting potential through our tool Commute IQ. With the data derived from origin and destination analysis, the delta between the actual from surveys and potential from Commute IQ can be robustly considered and thorough reduction plans set and managed. Next slide. And then there are reduction tools for employees. In line with the need for engagement, personal travel plans provide a valuable foundation by communicating to all employees their sustainable choices, spanning walking, cycling, public transport, and carpooling. And there's an interesting link there as well with sort of business travel and intra-site travel too. Where carpooling is concerned, we operate LiftShare. LiftShare is the largest carpooling platform in the UK with over 700,000 members. This technology supports the creation of schemes specific to a company or to a destination, such as a business or industrial park. Last but by no means least, we have Commute Boost, a tech solution delivering real-time data on commuting modes, combined with functionality for organisations to create specific challenges and incentivise travel behaviour change, which is obviously what we're all seeking to achieve in fleet, business travel and employee commuting. So, please do get in touch to find out more about what we do, visit our website, etc., to view case studies of our work. Okay, so that concludes presentations. Whilst we just sift, could do with some more questions coming through. We've got some, and there's a couple of deep ones about energy, so you've got plenty of time to talk about those ones, Chris and Michael. But just while we wait on those, just a quick mention of our next webinar, which is happening, I think it's, what did it say? Yep, 11th of February. Where we've got Rob Singleton from DFT coming to talk about their connectivity tool. So details on the screen, and I think we'll add a link either into chat or you'll get information about this through email. Okay, so if we can move on to questions. So interestingly, when I looked at your curve slide, the first section was energy. And we've got two questions here that really sort of zone in on the energy. I think I'll start with one which is, hopefully, you can explain a little deeper into what PPAs are, how they work, and what's involved. Do you want to tackle that one first?
Yeah, let me kick off on that, and Michael, do feel free to chip in. So what we see is that power purchase agreements are designed to offer additional security and hopefully a more attractive price. So when we look at the sort of overall context, as we explained, the ground is shifting beneath our feet a little bit on electric vehicles, both on the vehicles themselves and the infrastructure and the charging and the energy. For some organizations, that's just too many moving parts, and it can be really difficult to pin down the numbers in a way that you could actually, let's be honest, you could take them to your finance director and get them signed off. Sometimes you need that degree of certainty. So power purchase agreements are designed for that. They would typically be for the larger, more intensive users of energy. So, for example, if a business was looking to install a lot of charge points on its land, either because it's a retailer or it's open to the public, or it has a really intensive use of energy itself, that might be where a PPA could come into play. It probably wouldn't be for the sort of smaller kind of business or the less intensive user of energy, just because the agreement itself, it inherently limits options, and it's designed to deliver economies of scale. So we were working, for example, with a large business that has a lot of customers visiting its sites, and they're looking to secure a power purchase agreement as part of a sort of charging model where they could have chargers available for the public to use, but they wanted to provide a bit of security for themselves in that. Michael, do you want to add anything to that?
No, I mean, I think Chris covered off a lot of it. I mean, it really is being used to try and prevent the kind of fluctuations in electricity prices that might be felt across, different times of the year, but also different times of the day, and also then to benefit from basically power purchasing, where you can leverage different types of economies of scale to get a lower price across, it could be one site, but you could actually build across multiple sites into this agreement, and then have larger scales of electricity purchased so that you are getting that lower price per kilowatt hour. So there's multiple different types that can be built in. You can sort of have like your physical ones where you're basically getting a direct supply of electricity from the grid to your different sites, or you can have a sort of virtual one where you're basically having sort of the financial mechanisms across multiple sites being built into these agreements to then ensure that you're delivered those stable electricity prices, but also hopefully lower electricity prices based on the economies of scale that can be generated.
Great stuff. Thank you for that, both. Kind of is continuing that theme. So there's an energy and infrastructure, a financing piece. There's a question here from Martin Bowman. Thank you, Martin. Around provide some further insight into the financing piece, the as a service funded model, so the hardware, energy provision, and the like. How important is that to site owners and operators? I mean, yeah, I think it's a really interesting area in terms of how do you get the right fit for your organisation, I would say.
Yes, exactly. And as with many of these things, it's a kind of topic where it'll be bespoke and individual to every organisation. So depending on the number of vehicles that you have, how old they are, their current ownership model, what you do with them, all of these kind of questions will affect the extent to which the different options could be used to finance electrification. So specifically on that question of the as a service model, yeah, we're seeing that there are some kind of innovative financing products being developed by some companies to look at financing vehicles or even elements of the vehicles and or the charging infrastructure that they use. And so there's some moves towards looking at the kind of end-to-end provision of vehicle and charging together, or the sort of the battery and the charging, and that kind of applies differently whether you're an owner or an operator or a business. But yeah, the financing is a critical one. Some of the issues are again around the uncertainty, and so just as the power purchase agreement is designed to kind of reduce the uncertainty of the energy cost, so the financing of vehicles again can be sort of smoothing out that cost curve, so that perhaps the transition is less expensive up front or more affordable. It might, of course, carry higher costs in the longer term, but there are sort of questions around allocating risk and thinking about how much is affordable in every given year that an organisation might want to look at. Go on, Mike.
Yeah, just to add to this as well. I mean, I think the risk apportionment's almost key to this as a service model, especially in current times where the technological capability of the charging infrastructure, the vehicles, maybe ancillary services such as sort of your battery storage devices aren't well known and well documented at this stage. So basically, the individuals or organizations that are going to be purchasing these assets don't want to hold the residual value risk, and they feel it should be held by financiers or OEMs, etc., that have a better knowledge of the value of these assets and how they're going to be used throughout the future. So that's one sort of element that, if you don't have the expertise in house to be able to sit there and kind of forecast and have the secondary market, which provides you with assurances of the value of these assets going forward, then these as a service models are very important. It also, as Chris mentioned, it smooths those capital cycles. You don't want to put up a large upfront capital stake when a lot of these assets are going to be more expensive than your kind of internal combustion engine equivalents, or the charging infrastructure for like your grid connection or the battery storage devices that are going to be purchased as well are going to be relatively expensive. So it helps smooth the balance sheet, and then also spreads the operating risk, because a lot of the time with these as a service models, you can actually have them being operated by the provider, so that you don't actually have to worry about, say, ensuring that their charging infrastructure is going to be operational at your sites, or the vehicles are going to be charged up and ready for operation. So all these things sort of balances the risk out when you potentially don't have the knowledge in this current day as to how to operate or manage or dispose of these assets going forward. I do think there'll probably be a shift away from as a service models over the next 10 to 15 years when people become more comfortable with that technology. But I think currently, in the present day, it is going to be very, it's very useful for organizations to continue to spread that risk and ensure and provide assurances that operations are going to be as they were with the internal combustion engine equivalents.
Really interesting. Thanks, Michael. I had a question just around obviously recognizing that the majority of electric vehicles are being leased, and lease prices obviously prevalent on residual values and the used car market. Just wondering if you've got any insights or thoughts about how that's shaping up. You know, where do you see the used car market? How are you? What are customers saying about their sort of nervousness about, how much are these cars going to cost in the future?
I think the used car market's a really interesting one because now we're seeing over the last year or so that first wave of EVs that was popular 3 or 4 years ago, people's 3-year leases are coming up. And so now if you go onto Auto Trader or other used car sites are available, but you have a look, you'll see a lot of electric vehicles at a much lower price than you might imagine. And they're 3 or 4 years old and they've obviously got some miles on the clock because they've been used. But I think that there's a really interesting point about how that changes people's perceptions of electric vehicles, because there is still a common perception that electric vehicles are an expensive, they're a premium, they're a luxury item, that they're not for me, they're for other people doing other kinds of things. And I think as the used car market sort of swings into play, that's where a lot of people are getting their vehicles from. And so there are sort of second order effects that we might see or expect to see in terms of demand for charging, demand for different types of trips as well, because obviously different types of customers make different types of journeys. So there's quite a lot going on there from the used car market.
Yeah, I think as well, we haven't seen degradation to the level that was potentially expected or maybe forecasted at the worst end of the scale. So you actually are seeing these second-hand markets being able to operate duty cycles or have the range that is going to be required for continued operation for the majority of trips that are going to be undertaken. I think you'll probably have seen over the past 2 to 3 years that there were some quite large shocks to the second-hand prices of vehicles, mainly driven by OEMs actually reducing the premium prices that had been applied to electric vehicles as new competitors had come into the market. Now, these shocks obviously created uncertainty within that second-hand market, especially for those that own those leased vehicles, and it meant a lot of writing down of assets. Those shocks could still take place, but I think the kind of premium prices that you've seen on those vehicles, especially as new entrants have come in from the likes of China, have actually started to bring down those premium prices in the market, so you wouldn't actually see as large a shock within that secondary market. So leasers of vehicles are starting to feel a bit more confident that they won't be having to write down those sort of costs in the future and are actually looking to purchase more EVs within their fleet, just to make sure that they can benefit from some of the government grants that we've sort of already discussed, but also benefit from the potential more stable resale price going forward.
Yeah, I mean, I think leasing obviously helps organizations because it just is lowering the risk really in terms of what you might be left with at the end of a 3 or 4 year deal. So yes, for me it seems like it's going to be the predominant route for new electric vehicles entering the system. I guess we touched a little bit on pay per mile and perhaps how that might be offset by a VAT change. I mean, that applies across new and used vehicles, and I'm just kind of wondering, how any further sentiment or thoughts around those two constructs in terms of what it's going to do for the market. I mean, that 444,000 is a lot. I mean, if you think about this past year, 2 million new cars, of which 20, roughly a quarter, So 500,000 cars were electric vehicle. Well, what we're talking about there is a full year's worth of electric vehicles. So yeah, just any further sort of sentiment around those two constructs? Do you think it will happen? Do you think both will happen and they'll even each other out, and therefore the market will just continue to grow at the pace that it's growing?
It's a good question. It,
Can be your personal opinion. Doesn't have to be a
yeah,
KPMG opinion.
well, yeah. My own opinion is I think the genie's out of the bottle, and I don't think we're going back.
Mm.
Uh, I think what's interesting to me is, as I said earlier, that kind of sentiment change for customers as they view vehicles as, you know, you experience an EV, perhaps you rent one on holiday, or you go in a friend's one and you see what it's like, and you think, oh, this isn't what I thought it was going to be, in whatever way. And I think those are the kind of changes that are going to sort of percolate through the country and through the industry.
Mhm. It just car, yeah, we're making great progress with cars, and you mentioned right at the start there, Michael, the number of models that are available and those that are coming on. But LCVs and HGVs, vans and trucks, there isn't as much choice, admittedly, but then we've also got some pretty pressing dates coming forward. You think about the NHS, all owned and leased vehicles, I think excluding some specialist vehicles, ambulances and the like, need to be zero emission by 2027/28. So how is this disconnect gonna play out in terms of, are there the models to support these activities?
So, I mean, I think a lot of the drivetrain technology is there for a lot of these use cases. So it's really just making sure that you kind of have the body and chassis that can then align to that. So I would say that, I mean, there's a lot of new vehicles coming onto the market, and these models are sort of they have been stated by OEMs that they're going to be able to provide the supply of these vehicles to meet the demand. Personally, I'm not sure how quickly they'll be able to actually fulfill orders if they were going to be transitioned as quickly. Vans would be a lot more capable of doing that. Vans are in a much better place just because the total cost of ownership is becoming a lot more closer to parity. So they understand that the demand is going to be there to then drive that supply going forward. For the heavier duty vehicles, going up to your 44 tons, you will see that the supply chain is basically about a 6-month wait, I think, almost a minimum, to get these vehicles on the road. So if supply did shift very, very quickly, maybe pushed by reductions in prices or this plug-in truck grant, then it will be interesting to see how they do cope to try and actually meet the demand of these different vehicles. I think as well, especially speaking with the operators who are operating your LCVs and HGVs, a lot of them, because there isn't that kind of cost parity as yet, a lot of them are looking to your bridging fuels. They're looking to your sort of biofuels, your HVOs, etc., to then actually reduce those emissions to the targeted rates by the government. And then they'll look to transition into the maybe like zero emission equivalents by 2032, 2035, 2040, when those deadlines need to be hit for the HGVs. So I think that is going to be the slower cycle, but I think the bridging fuels are going to be utilized for the most part. And then you'll look at your zero emission fuels getting transitioned in the next 5 to 10 years.
Very helpful. That's really useful. Thank you. Just on vans, there's a question here from Tim Scott. Thank you, Tim. Talking about the fleet of mainly vans, and actually one of the blockers is the cost, associated with the infrastructure for charge points, underlying groundworks. Question here about whether or not we know whether government grant funding can support any of that kind of stuff and/or funding routes. Don't know if you've come across that, either Chris or Michael.
So there is an EV infrastructure grant which can be used to help deploy charge points. It's not huge, and it's more for the actual kind of charge point itself, but can help with some of the civils that go alongside that. But this is something that we have spoken with government about and sort of stated, especially alongside the plug-in truck grant, but also alongside the car grants as well, that infrastructure is a major blocker there, and it is something that is currently a bit of a blind spot. I know that there's certain discussions that are being held for the new year, which could potentially be building in some new funding or some new grant funding schemes that could help build out the charging infrastructure support that could be provided. But at the current day, there's not a huge amount there to really support. But I know, especially within the UK, but also Scotland, that they're both looking into these grants. And I mean, just a side note as well, there is quite a bit of funding for the public charging grants. So like, your Levi funding, and up in Scotland, they've got their own equivalent, which is like the zero, or is the charging infrastructure grant funding up there as well. But I know that doesn't really help organisations so much, because you're not really getting a discount on the price that has been charged by that public charging infrastructure. It's just ensuring that there's charge points there to charge with.
Well, that segues quite nicely with a question or a statement here, comment by Adrian around, you mentioned that EV infrastructure grant looking like it might close in March. I'm guessing that's the current tranche. Perhaps it's going to be a revamp, an additional tranche of grant for the coming financial year. But as it stands at the minute, perhaps not. So, okay, it's one definitely to watch in terms of the grants that are coming through. And I guess you're keeping your finger on the pulse in terms of what things are available for large enterprises to tap into. More on the charitable side, a question from Damien here about any additional advice for community transport organisations who depend, heavily currently on ICE minibuses, for example.
Yeah, it's a really interesting question, Damien. Thanks. I guess it's, in many ways, it's similar in that you'd want to understand, how much your vehicles are being used. For example, how many miles do you drive in a given day or a week? Are there opportunities to build charging into what you're doing anyway? So, for example, if you're using the minibus and you're taking people to an event, that the place where that event is held might have a charger point there, and if that's the case, then that would be a simpler way to shift to electric. Again, the kind of vehicles that are available and the capabilities and the costs are changing all the time, and new vehicles are coming onto the market, which may meet your needs more and more as time goes on.
Conscious of time, got a couple of minutes, but I think there's one last one here, which is about sort of just general reimbursement for staff travel, grey fleet, whether it be fleet or grey fleet, making business trips from home. Obviously, this is quite a changing picture as well in terms of AMAP rates applicable, and obviously, I think there's an interesting space about, with a carpooling hat on as well, the extent to which perhaps employer and government support in terms of people who are taking trips together in an electric car is fantastic. A shared electric vehicle is even better. But yeah, just any last sort of comments in terms of latest thinking or direction around reimbursements?
I think it is the kind of thing that has to be looked at quite carefully. When we published our thought leadership at the back end of last year, we included some thinking around taxation. We haven't picked that up this morning because it is something that has to be considered really carefully. There are ways that you can look at reimbursing people. The rates at which things can happen and the limitations just have to be looked at really carefully. So it's definitely something that we think businesses would be well advised to look at, because it can be something that might cut costs. For example, if employees can charge vehicles at home, it reduces the need to install chargers on your own site, and often is more cost attractive as well.
Just a final bit, there was a piece there about sort of home charging and support for that. Obviously, typically within lease arrangements, there'll be some support in terms of a home charger or credits towards public charging and the like. So I think there's quite a bit of support that's available out there. Fabulous. I think we are on time, 12 o'clock. Again, thank you, Chris. Thank you, Michael, for the time. Thank you for everyone for joining. Bye bye.